have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Martin Luther King, just a supreme political, spiritual person, someone who dedicated his life and indeed gave his life for the idea of freedom. He was able to achieve this kind of celebrity, because I think there are a number of Martin Luther Kings. I think there are a lot of unknown people who give their lives to an idea. But Martin found a place in time that brought together his spirituality along with political events. I'm not sure how much he was simply reflecting his time and how much he caused events to happen. I think probably 50-50 or some combination. But he is an embodiment of the person who seizes the time. My name is James Plunky Branch. I'm also known as Plunky Nkabinde. I was born in Richmond, Virginia in the US in July of 1947, which makes me quite an old man to do what I'm doing. I am a musician by trade, though I like to think of myself as an educator. I've always had an interest in science. Later I developed an intense interest in politics and the history of culture in general. I've been doing this for 35 years, which is quite a long time. If you mention Britney Spears or Beyonce, I've been doing it for longer than they've been alive. So it makes me a musical artist.
Keep us together.
I wanted to be a musician because music was so important to my growing up. I think my first influence of music on my life was through the church, and music played such a very important part of my religious experience. Music in the South, when I grew up, the radio station playing the rhythm and blues and the blues music on the air was, in some ways, our only entertainment. It was the only thing that I had when I was growing up. And as I said, I think what pushed me to be in music was I always loved the saxophone solos in the middle of those R&B records, and I wanted to be the guy that took that solo. Now, I have to say that I took piano when I was about 7 or 8 years old. And when I was 9, we moved from one place to another, and we could not take the piano. It was too heavy. And so I left my piano lessons, but I took clarinet in school. And my music teacher informed my mother that I had a great natural ability in music. I'm not sure if I was destined to be a musician. I think I could have been many things. When I was young, my grandfather thought that I would be a preacher. He told my mother, he said, "That boy can talk. He's going to be a preacher." When I was growing up, participated in a number of demonstrations. During the late 60s, when I went to college at Columbia University in New York, in the year of 1968, there was a series of college demonstrations across the United States that began with 2 universities, one Berkeley in California, and the other being Columbia in New York. In Columbia, we forcibly took over the campus. We held the administrators hostage for a time. We took over the campus to protest the war, to protest the conditions of black people. So very definitely, I myself have been committed to political activity. I was drafted into the Army to go fight in the Vietnam War. And as a protest, I left the Army. I ran away. I was a deserter in technical terms, and I moved from New York to San Francisco. San Francisco and Berkeley, being a very left-wing area of the country, was very sympathetic to people who were not for the war. When I was in San Francisco, I got involved with the Black Panther Party, the movement that we call the Soledad movement around George Jackson. I helped with the arrangements for Angela Davis when she was a fugitive, all the while I myself was a fugitive from the FBI. So the music that I made during that period would be political because that was what I was involved in. And so as we talked about, music often reflects what's going on in society.
One world, one music. One world, one music. One world, one music. One world, one music. One world, one people. One world, one people. One world, one people. One world, one. Well, the music in effect, and anyhow, it's time to move. To get down, forget your inhibition. Just listen. There's no reason not to change your condition into something you can use to get into the groove. It's made to move you out on the dance floor, up on the ceiling. This beat will have you rocking and reeling from the top to the bottom, from the bottom to the top now. Shake your booty and don't stop now. Dance to the rhythm, dance to the rhythm, dance. Dance to the rhythm, dance to the rhythm.
I think funk originally and oftentimes is not overtly political. I agree. I think funk is largely a party music. But I could give numerous examples of funky music that has been to varying degrees political. I could say James Brown when he says, "Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud," or even James Brown when he sang "The Big Payback," or Parliament Funkadelic, which is one of the funkiest bands ever. They do, when they say, "People, what you doing? Standing on the verge of getting it on, really good." I think they don't just mean standing on the verge of getting it on in terms of partying. I think they mean standing on the verge of making a political activity. So many times funk bands do what a tradition that comes all the way from the black slavery period in the US, which is to have codes, secret messages within the music. Sometimes it's embedded in the music in a way that if you're aware, you get it. And if you're not aware, you don't. And this comes from the tradition of where black people had slave masters. And in order to communicate, we might create a song that has a different meaning so that the slave master wouldn't necessarily know what we were saying. So you might sing an old spiritual song, you might say, "Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home." Well, you didn't just mean carry me home to a spiritual home. You might mean carry me back to Africa. Or you might say, "Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus." It's a thing to say, tonight would be a good night to steal away, to get away. And so sometimes we are singing funk songs with double meanings. And so in that way, the funk can be very political as well as a party music.
Get up, get on up, get up, get on up. Stay on the scene, get on up, like a record machine. Get on up, get up, get on up. You got to get up, get on up. You're gonna stay on the scene, get on up, like a sex machine. James would say, it's too funky, funky in here. It's too funky to funk, rock my behalf. It's too funky, funky in here. Too funky to funk, rock my behalf. Now check this out. This is not James Brown's band. This is Plunky's band. Plunky's band. Spell it, y'all. Spell it. Plunky's We're Plunky's band. And we got to be funky.
James Brown was called him the godfather of soul. I believe that. He's the person who elevated soul music from mere entertainment to something that could influence people's lives in a profound way. James Brown played organ and some drums, but largely his role is that of band leader and chief inspirer. He may hire better musicians than he himself is, but he is able to get the most from those musicians. I love him because James Brown is largely an improviser, but he's a very important musician in terms of elevating soul music beyond. Up until James Brown, there was this idea, race music it was called. And black music was compartmentalized to just blues and rhythm and blues, and it was a separate category, sold largely to black people. With James Brown, the music began this process of crossing over.
Take us over the road. Man made the train. Baby. Baby.
The most important horn player in rhythm and blues music for me is Maceo Parker. Maceo's approach to playing the saxophone had a great jazz melodic structure, but most important was the way that he plays rhythm against the rhythm section with his licks, with his horn riffs. But Pee Wee Ellis, Fred Wesley, those guys created a horn section that was just as rhythmic as the rhythm section. And so you have this syncopation going between the rhythm section and the horns. They happen to be individually great improvisers, great soloists, but they played together so well. Many times horn players who are great improvisers are not great ensemble players. It's the same with vocalists. Many vocalists who are great soloists have difficulty singing with a group of singers. And that's because you spend so much time creating your individual voice, you don't spend a lot of time blending. And so it is with John Coltrane, great improviser, but you don't find him playing with a whole ensemble. I loved Pharaoh Sanders. I was Pharaoh Sanders' groupie. And when he would play in San Francisco, I would go every night. If he played at the club 5 nights, I was there first and would leave last. He would just see me. One time I was playing myself. He played in San Francisco, and from there he went to Detroit, and from there he went to New York. And it just so happened I was playing with Ndiko Aba, the Zulu from South Africa, and we had a gig in Detroit. And so I saw Pharaoh 5 nights in San Francisco, and it just so happened the next night he was in Detroit, I was in Detroit, and he saw me there, and he said, and then the next night I went on to New York, and like the week later he was in New York and saw me there, and I would always have my Shaker Ray, and I'd play with him and do all this, and he would just, you know, I'm sure he thought, wow, this guy's followed me all across the country. It just so happened that I had gigs. So finally he just said, listen, you come and do a recording with me, an album called Wisdom Through Music, and that's been a great honor for me because Pharaoh is my idol, and I love the way he makes the saxophone speak. Pharaoh may not be the most technically proficient saxophonist ever to live. He can just make one note have the impact of 50 notes because the tone is so felt. He can take a long tone. Anikulapi Kuti was one of my favorite musicians because his music that was called Afrobeat reminded me of James Brown meets West Africa. Fela is a very important person because he played tenor saxophone, as I do. 2, he was a very political musician. I did have a chance to meet him, and I met him in Nigeria at a jam session. One point in Fela's life, he had been put in prison. And he had been beaten badly, and he had been beaten about the mouth, and he couldn't play saxophone for about 6 months. And so we played at a place called the Extended Jazz Family. It's the name of a club in Lagos. And I was at a very, very big advantage because at this place, they were not playing Afrobeat, they were playing jazz standards. So this is a music that I knew really well and a music that Pharaoh did not know so well. And so I would get very large applause and he would not get so much. So after a while, he said, I'm leaving, but I'm the one who's going to get meat pie tonight. And he was right. He was the one who was going to have a woman. I was going back to my hotel room by myself. So that's my story about Pharaoh. I am connected to Africa in a number of ways. I'm connected to Africa historically because the music, the history of Africa is recorded in the music. It's not so much written down, particularly the history of Africa as it relates to African Americans. I'm also connected politically because where I grew up early in my life was in the South. There, I grew up in a very segregated, almost apartheid kind of a situation. This forced me to study where this came from. And it's not possible to study the history without knowing in America, the vast majority of the African Americans came there as a result of their ancestors being brought there as slaves. But in my lifetime, because I love jazz music and I loved soul music, and then lastly, after some 15 or 20 years of studying African music, I had a chance to go to Africa. And so I've been to Africa 6 times, to Nigeria, to Ghana, to the Gambia, to Togo, to study the music. So in that way, I'm directly related to Africa, not symbolically, just very physically, very musically, very directly related to Africa. I would define the foundations of my music and the band's music as really based in the African tradition. Even though I think of myself as being quite a modernist, I'm very well grounded, very well based on the African traditions. And I oftentimes teach people about the music. It has 5 characteristics. Number 1, the music tends to be very rhythmic, polyrhythmic. Number 2, the music has a kind of a high energy. Not just physical energy to play the instruments, but a kind of emotional, mental involvement, and even a spiritual involvement with the music. Thirdly, there's something called improvisation. Black music in general is very improvisational. We're trying to be in the moment. That's quite a contrast to Western European music, where the music is oftentimes written down, meant to be very much the same all the time. With us, we would like to play the song 1,000,000 times and make it different 1,000,000 times. Another part of the African tradition is that the music tends to be very functional. We're not just exploring the music from an objective point of view. We want to be involved with the music, and we want the music to do something. And lastly, African music tends to be very communal. That means, contrary to a classical concert where you go and you come and sit and everybody watches what goes on the stage, in the African tradition, everybody participates. And so we spend a lot of time trying to get the audience to clap, to move, to dance. Because in the African tradition, music isn't complete unless you have the musicians, you have singing or the words, and you have movement. And that's sort of the definition of music in Africa. I would not call my music a revenge against my environment or my history when I was young, though I would have to admit my music is a direct result of my experiences, and I long for a time when the world, as Martin Luther King would say, judges people just based on their character and what they do, as opposed to in any way being prejudicial. But I don't see that world yet. I see places where we go and where we commune and where we get along with one another, but I also see a world where the Southern Hemisphere is oppressed by the Northern Hemisphere. I see vestiges of colonialism. I see overt racism in some places. I see people, even of the same race, oppressing others of their race. And so I would say people like me who would like to take on the task of bettering the world in this situation, our work is not yet done. And so my music, I don't think of it as revenge, but I do think of it in reaction to oppression.
These are African rhythms passed down to us from the ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Stand up, clap your hands, move to the rhythms, the rhythms, the rhythms, the rhythms, the rhythms. Make it clap your hands. The rhythms, the rhythms, the rhythms, the rhythms. Make you wanna dance. The rhythms, the groove, the tempo, the beat. The rhythms are everywhere. Party people meet. If you ever wonder where the rhythms come from, they come from the spirit of the people of the sun. DC, the cap of the go-go sound. The way you shake your booty they be really throwing down. In Minneapolis, Prince Rock, Trey Side Hendrick, and James Brown stock. Ohio gave us show bands to pump up the nation after Motown Act laid the foundation. Funkadelic made us smell it and tried to make us eat it. Michael sacrificed his nose to try to beat it. New York disco was a dance sensation, but only after rhythm and blues migration. The last poets, Gil Scott and Sheeta Sugar Hillin'. Without them, all young rappers would be illin'. New Orleans gay, Chicago the blues, and then our house mixes are the Wintertown news. The rhythms of the cities with the hip-hop beat are African rhythms that we take it to the streets. Sing! Get us together, the rhythms keep us together, keep us together, the rhythms get us together, the rhythms keep us together, keep us together,
the rhythms, African rhythms,
get us together,
I'll make you clap your hands,
the rhythms
African rhythms,
keep us together,
I'll make you dance,
the rhythms
African rhythms,
get us together,
I'll make you clap your hands,
the rhythms
African rhythms,
keep us together. Say it again, y'all. Say it again, y'all. African rhythms.
I'll make you clap your hands, African rhythms, oh, yeah, you wanna dance, African rhythms, I'll make you clap your hands, African rhythms, show us how make you wanna dance.
You've been listening to Plunky and Oneness featuring Lady Kaiji on the vocals. It's been our great pleasure to be here with you in Paris. If you had a good time, give yourselves a round of applause. These are African rhythms passed down to us from the ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Stand up, clap your hands, y'all. Clap your hands, y'all. These are African rhythms. Stand up, clap your hands, y'all. These are African rhythms. Stand up, clap your hands, clap your hands, clap your hands. These are African rhythms. Sing it, guided. African rhythms, sing. African rhythms. Make you clap your hands. African rhythms. Keep us together. The rhythms. Get us together. The rhythms. Keep us together. Say it again, y'all. Say it again, sir. Get us together. The rhythms. Keep us together. The rhythms. Get us together. The rhythms. Keep us. Let the rhythms take you. Let the rhythms take you to the truth. Let the rhythms take you to the truth. Let the rhythms